Chapter 14 of number 17 by Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wherein Theydon suffers from faint heart. Furneaux, with that phenomenally clear mind of his, had perceived and expressed in one trenchant sentence the outstanding and almost unique feature of the tragic mystery which centred around the death of Edith Lester. Theydon's connection with either international finance or the rebirth of China was as remote as that of the man in the moon. Yet he had been pitchforked by fate into an active and indeed dominating influence over those phases of both undertakings which were peculiar to London. Theydon mused on this element in an unprecedented situation as he sat in the taxicab which bore him swiftly to Ennismore Mansions. Another quite abnormal condition was the ignorance of London with regard to the fierce struggle now being waged in its midst. On the one hand, a few Oriental fanatics, most of whom were probably less swayed by racial enthusiasm than by good payment for services rendered, were carrying out the orders of a master criminal with a sublime indifference to the laws framed by the foreign devils whom they despised. On the other were ranged the three members of the Forbes family and Theydon himself, supported by the forces of the Crown, it was true, but singularly isolated from the knowledge and sympathy of their fellow citizens. Miss Beale hardly counted. The servants in Fortescue Square shared with Bates and his wife a sort of territorial interest in the fight. When Fortune picked an occasional warrior for the fray, she chose a man from Chicago, a motorcyclist from Eastbourne, a policeman in Charing Cross Road. How portentous had been that hand raised to stem the traffic at a congested corner on the Monday night! Into what a vortex of crime and passion had it not pointed, all unknowing! If the cab in which Theydon was hurrying home from Daly's Theatre had not been delayed by the dispute between driver and policeman, he would never have known that the millionaire visited Ennismore Mansions, and the subsequent course of the night's history might have left him wholly unaffected. Then his wayward thoughts took to brooding on the grey car which shadowed him from Waterloo to Fortescue Square, and again from the square to his own abode. If it held some member of the embassy staff, why had no more been heard of it? And what had Winter and Furneaux meant by hinting that far wider issues were bound up with the affair than the authorities were yet at liberty to divulge? The attack on Forbes, sinister and malevolent in its scope and purpose, was, in a sense, open warfare. But it was impossible to guess what part, if any, the official representatives of China filled in the fray. Were they active allies of Scotland Yard, or did they hold what is known in the law courts as a watching brief? He could not tell. He only knew that each successive period of 24 hours broadened the area covered by the struggle, and there, at least, he found solid backing for the little detective's demand that the threatened people should dwell under one roof. His pulses quickened at the notice that this new departure implied constant association with Evelyn Forbes. Yet what did it avail? Why should he dream of fanning into a fiercer fury the flames of his love? As matters stood, he had about as much chance of marrying Evelyn Forbes as of becoming Emperor of China. The incongruity of the situation was illustrated with cruel accuracy by the fact that he could ill afford the stoppage of his work demanded by the present trend of events. He earned what might be regarded as a good income by his pen, but his expenses were not light, and he had deemed himself fortunate the previous year when he was able to invest £100. As a matter of fact, the interest on his securities paid for his gloves and ties. Another lucky year might see him provided for life with boots and socks. He pictured himself, if he were idiot enough, when all this turmoil was ended, to pose as a suitor for Evelyn Forbes's hand, explaining his financial position to the millionaire, and wilting under the scornful amusement in those earnest, deep-seeing eyes. Phew! He grew hot at the mere notion of such folly. Little wonder, therefore, that the driver of the taxi should gaze quizzically after Theydon's alert figure as it vanished in the stairway of Innismore Mansions. "Got the hump, and pretty bad," soliloquized the man. "Gimme a bob over the fare, so can't be stony. But Lord love a duck, you never can tell." Theydon was about to unlock the door of his flat when it opened in his face, and his sister nearly collided with him. She screamed slightly, a certain quality of alarm in her exclamation merging instantly into joyful recognition. "So you have come home!" she cried. "My goodness, what a fright you've given me!" "Why?" he said, with a reassuring and brotherly hug. "I've had horrid dreams. I couldn't rest all last night for thinking of you." "Is George absent?" George was her husband, a consulting engineer whose professional duties often took him to distant parts of the country. "Yes." "Then you and Miss Beale have been living on tea and scraps? Really, Molly, I credited you with more sense. Tell me what you ate last night, and I'll diagnose your dreams." "We dined at a first-class restaurant in the West End," said Mrs. Paxton indignantly. "It would be much more to the point if you explained how you have been living the past few days. I have not been so worried about anything since George was trapped in that horrid mine." Molly was on the verge of tears. Her brother resolved instantly to minimize matters, or she would fret more than ever on his account. "Now look here, old girl," he said, meeting her critical glance steadily. "Miss Beale has been putting absurd notions into that stylish little head of yours. By the way, is that the latest thing in hats? It suits you admirably." Mrs. Paxton smiled, though her eyes were glistening suspiciously. "You can't humbug me, Frank, so please don't try," she protested. "Why are you mixed up in this dreadful business? Why are you constantly meeting detectives? Why did you rush off to Eastbourne yesterday? When did you become acquainted with this Mr. Forbes? Have you seen his daughter?" Theydon was at least sufficiently well versed in the peculiarities of the feminine temperament to know that he would be safe in answering the last question first. "Yes," he said, "I have seen a good deal of Miss Forbes recently. Have you ever met her?" "She was at the Horse Show last year with Lady de Winton's party. She's an awfully pretty girl, and will be worth millions, I suppose. Some one said that young de Winton was simply crazy about her. But he looked such a sloppy youth that I could hardly imagine those two getting married. Of course, there's the title. Yet a title is not everything." Young de Winton! Theydon had not even been aware hitherto of the existence of a marriageable scion of that noble house. "That particular young spark has not been in evidence during the past few days, at any rate," he commented, and his voice was not so nonchalant as he imagined, because Mrs. Paxton looked up quickly. "Perhaps it was only idle gossip," she said. "Is Miss Forbes a nice girl to talk to? She struck me as being very animated." Animated, while in the company of that undoubted oaf de Winton! Theydon choked back something tinged with gall as he replied quietly, "She could not very well help being highly intelligent. Her father and mother are charming people. I was introduced to Mr. Forbes owing to a magazine commission to write an article about his interest in aviation. Now you see how promptly even the most gorgeous bubble bursts when it impinges against a solid little fact. As it happens, Mr. Forbes and I will have so much in common during the next day or two that I am now going to stay with him. I came here to pack a portmanteau. If you'll be a good little girl and listen while I'm at the telephone, you will hear all about it." The words were no sooner uttered than he wanted to recall them. It would be no easy matter to discuss Furneaux's suggestion with any one in Fortescue Square without letting his sister into the secret that the visit was necessitated by considerations of his own personal safety. Mrs. Paxton's eyes were sparkling with a new interest. "I had no idea you were on terms of such intimacy with the family," she cried. "Don't tell me, Frank, that your flights have taken you to the elevated region in which millionaires' daughters figure as possible brides?" "Now you are making me out a Mormon," and Theydon grinned fiercely. "You know what I mean. This Miss Forbes. By the way, what is her Christian name?" "Let me see. I think I have heard it. Doris, is it? Or Phyllis? No, I remember now. Evelyn." "Oh, then, if you are so vague on that point, I suppose I must reconcile myself to owning a bachelor brother again." He shook his head at her. "Ah, you women," he said. "Yet I used to regard you as quite a sensible person, Molly. Now, how in the name of goodness could I possibly entertain any notion of marrying the only daughter of a man in Forbes's position?" "It all depends," was the illogical but crushing retort. "There are plenty of millionaires' daughters whom I would not regard as good enough for my brother. And let me tell you, the family is making progress. A little bird whispered the other day that George's name will appear in the next list of honours. He is to receive a knighthood." It was not new to Theydon to learn that his brother-in-law stood in high favour with the government because Paxton had been appointed on 2 royal commissions with reference to mining regulations. But he affected a surprised incredulity, as offering a way of escape from an inquisition which he dreaded. "Dear me," he smirked. Therein he erred. His sister gave him a puzzled glance. "You are not yourself to-day, Frank," she said dubiously. "You are acting. For whose benefit? Not mine, surely?" "If your prospective ladyship will pardon me, I will now go to the telephone," he countered. Anything, even a mad jumble of incoherence in his talk with the Forbes household, was better than the troubled scrutiny of those clear brown eyes. Leaving the door open so that his sister could hear his side of the conversation, he rang up No. 11 Fortescue Square. The butler answered. "That you, Tomlinson?" said Theydon. "Will you ask Mr. Forbes if I am to turn up for afternoon tea? If it is more convenient that I should arrive later, I have lots of things to attend to, and can fill in a few hours easily." "I really don't know what to say, sir," came the astonishing answer. "Mrs. Forbes has been shot." "Great heavens!" "Yes, sir. She was merely looking out through the drawing-room window when someone fired at her from a passing motor-car." "Do you mean that she is dead?" "No, sir. Not quite so bad as that. The bullet struck her left shoulder. A few inches lower, and it would have pierced her heart. The doctors are with her now. I—" Some interruption took place on the line, and the butler's voice ceased. Theydon, careless now as to what construction his sister might place on his words, was about to storm at the Exchange for cutting the communication. He meant to say that on no consideration would he inflict the presence of a stranger at such a terrible moment, when a coldly metallic, almost harsh question reached him. "That you, Theydon?" "Yes." Forbes was speaking. "I was crossing the hall and guessed it might be you. Come as soon as you are at liberty. You will be welcome. If we are to be besieged, I want someone who will not be afraid to shoot. These policemen are too scrupulous. They saw some cursed Mongol leaning out through the window of the closed car, and could have either shot him or put a bullet so close that his aim would have been disturbed. As it was, my wife only escaped death by the mercy of Providence. She bent slightly at the very instant the would-be assassin fired, and the bullet simply lacerated her shoulder. After this I'll defend myself and my womenfolk, but I need at least one other man whom I can trust. Will you come?" "I'll be with you within 20 minutes." He heard the clang of the receiver being replaced on its rest at the other end of the wire. Somehow the sound conveyed a new determination on Forbes's part. He had his back to the wall. No matter what view the law took of his action subsequently, he would protect his dear ones at all hazards. After that, Theydon hesitated no longer. "Bates," he cried, "throw into a bag such clothes as I shall need for a few days' stay in Mr. Forbes's house. When I am gone, pack your own boxes and take a week's holiday. Go anywhere you like out of London, but go at once. Send me your address, care of Mr. Forbes, and I'll let you know when I want you again." "If it's a matter of holding out against them—" Bates intended making a declaration of war, but his employer broke in emphatically. "I want you to obey my orders fully and unquestionably," he said. Bates promptly became the well-trained valet once more. "Yes, sir," he said. "Your portmanteau will be ready in 10 minutes. Half an hour later, me and Mrs. Bates will leave for my cousin's place in Hampshire." Theydon returned to the sitting-room. His sister's face was white with fear, but he threw restraint to the winds. "Molly," he said, placing his hand on her shoulders, "you are very dear to me. But there is one woman in the world who, if fate proves kind, may yet be dearer. She is in danger. If someone said that of you to your husband, what would he do?" She kissed him with tremulous lips. "He would act just as you are going to act," she said. "But, dear, can't you trust me? I cannot help, perhaps, but I can pray for you." "Well, then, sis, I won't fence with you any longer. There's a sort of feud between Mr. Forbes and a faction in China. He helped the reformers financially, and some supporters of the dethroned dynasty are trying to compel him by force to give them a list of the prominent men who control the revolution. If he yields, it means that nearly 100 leading men in China, men whose only thought is the welfare and progress of their country, will be ruthlessly murdered. If he continues to refuse, his own life and the lives of his wife and daughter are at stake. These fiends killed Mrs. Lester within a few feet of this very room. They killed her husband 6 months ago. They tried to kidnap Evelyn Forbes yesterday, and succeeded for a while in carrying off her mother, their plan being to torture one or both, even unto death. Heaven help me, I love Evelyn Forbes, and I would count my life well spent if I died in defending her. Should anything happen to me, and she is spared, tell her that, will you? And my spirit will thank you. We must not think of death, but of life, was the brave answer. Can I do anything? Could George assist if he were here? No, Molly. Perhaps I am exaggerating matters, though the history of this week would make strange reading if published broadcast. Indeed, I shall now urge on Mr. Forbes the advisability of sending the facts to the press. London would be stirred to its depths, and every one of its citizens would be quick to observe and report the presence of Chinamen or Japanese in the West End. Some innocent Orientals would suffer, but the police might at least be enabled to capture the pestiferous gang which has committed this latest outrage. Just think of some cold-blooded scoundrel shooting at a sweet-mannered and gentle lady like Mrs. Forbes. Surely the authorities can protect her? That is the wild absurdity of the position. Of course, you didn't hear what Mr. Forbes said. The armed detectives on duty in his house actually saw the Chinaman who fired the shot which wounded her, leaning out through the window of a closed car. But they cannot blaze away at any passer-by merely because he is or resembles an Asiatic. What they dare not do, however, he and I will endeavour cheerfully. Bates? Yes, sir, came the cry from a bedroom. If you are packing 2 bags, put that pistol and a box of cartridges in the smaller one. Yes, sir. Mrs. Paxton, at this crisis, proved herself a woman of spirit. I think you're right, Frank, she said quietly. I refuse to believe that any British court of justice would blame any man for defending the lives of his wife and daughter, nor you for helping him. If the peacefully disposed Chinese residents in London wish to avoid risk, let them keep away from number 11 Fortescue Square. May I come with you? You, Molly? He looked at her with troubled eyes. For the moment, such was the fire in his brain, he did not understand. She laughed gallantly. I don't mean as one of the garrison, she said. May I not make the acquaintance of these people? Sometimes the mere knowledge that others are aware of one's troubles and sympathizing with one is comforting. Miss Beale is not expecting me till tea-time. I told her I might lunch with you. Indeed, I promised to call at her hotel for her letters, and that is halfway on your road. You're a brick, Molly, said her brother. I do believe Evelyn Forbes will be glad to see you. The most amazing thing about this affair is that none of the many friends Mr. and Mrs. Forbes and their daughter must possess in London has the slightest inkling of the truth. I suppose the servants are instructed to tell ordinary callers that the various members of the family are out, or some of them indisposed, or something of the sort. But come along. I hear Bates banging my belongings into the passage. I'm in a fever to be there and taking part in the row. Soon they were seated in a taxi and speeding to Smith's Hotel, Jermyn Street. Have you invited Miss Beale to reside with you while she's in London, sis? Said Theydon, allowing his thoughts to dwell for a moment on the less tragic side of events. Yes, what else could I do? Poor thing, she was terrified at the notion of sleeping under the same roof as a Chinaman. I don't blame her, but there's a certain element of risk for you, Molly. Oh, bother, don't tell me that a few Chinamen can threaten all London. Yet even the valiant-hearted Mrs. Paxton yielded to the haunting terror of the bandits when the taxi drew in behind a grey car, already standing at the curb outside Smith's Hotel, and her brother grasped her wrist in sudden warning. "Sit still," he said. "Now we may get on to the track of the gang. That is the car which followed me on Monday night." His sister, of course, did not understand. She had heard nothing of the pursuit and its curious sequel. "Do you mean it is one of the cars which these men use?" she whispered breathlessly. "Yes, I'll explain that later. But what impudence! The scoundrels have not even changed the number plate." Unquestionably, the number of the grey landaulette, now within a few feet of them, was XY1314. Theydon stooped, opened a dressing-case lying at his feet, and took out the automatic pistol placed there by Bates. He put it in the right-hand pocket of his coat. "Now I'll reconnoitre," he said, and opened the door. The taxi-driver was already gazing curiously in at his fares, wondering why one or both did not alight. "Be ready to start the instant I want you," said Theydon to the man, and he strolled past the grey car, with every sense alert, every muscle braced. If Wang Li Fu were seated inside, he would cover him with the pistol and hold him there until the police came, or shoot him dead if he offered any resistance. Fortunately, therefore, all things considered, the interior of the car was absolutely empty, save for a copy of the Times on the back seat. Even the presence of the newspaper was significant. In that issue should have appeared Forbes's reply to Y.M., which Furneaux had suppressed as unnecessary. There was a chauffeur at the wheel, no Chinaman, but a tightly buttoned and black-legginged young Englishman, in fact, the real thing in chauffeurs. "Whose car is this?" demanded Theydon. "It belongs to the Chinese Embassy, sir," said the man, answering civilly enough, but not unnaturally showing some surprise at the curt question. "Are you waiting here for some official of the Embassy?" went on Theydon. "Not exactly, sir. Some friends of His Excellency." The man glanced towards the door of the hotel. "Here they are now," he added. Theydon turned. Two Chinamen, sedate, pig-tailed persons, were descending the steps. With them was Furneaux. One of the Orientals gave Theydon a rather sharp glance, having noticed, apparently, that he was conversing with the chauffeur. But Furneaux, after a stonily indifferent stare, said to the second Chinaman, in plain English, "Do you mind dropping me at Scotland Yard?" "With pleasure," was the composed reply. The three entered, and the grey car made off, leaving Theydon to gaze blankly after it. His sister, though badly scared at first, quickly recovered her self-possession. She even made a joke of the incident. "As an anti-climax, Frank, that is the best thing of its kind you've ever brought off," she tittered. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of number 17 by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Forceful tactics. Though a prey to that most burdensome of cares, the uneasy consciousness of an impalpable yet ever-threatening evil, Theydon was not blind to the humorous element in the present situation. Mrs. Paxton, of course, did not know who the little man accompanying the Chinamen was. She had seen her brother stock the motor car and its presumed occupants in the most approved melodramatic fashion, and could not help noticing his complete discomfiture. Naturally, she imagined he had encountered a pair of perfectly harmless citizens of the Middle Kingdom, and, being one of those happy beings, more readily swayed to laughter than to tears, rallied him upon an apparent blunder. "Never before have I discovered a neurotic streak in you, Frank," she said, after he had obtained a couple of letters for Miss Beale, and they were en route again. "Come now, confess. If Evelyn Forbes, or, let me see, is it Phyllis or Doris? No, Evelyn. If Evelyn Forbes, then, did not happen to be a remarkably pretty girl, would you really attach such terrific importance to the mad goings-on of a set of Chinese fanatics? I doubt it." The cab was threading its way through the traffic of St. James Street and Piccadilly on a busy afternoon in the season, and Theydon had much to tell her before they arrived at Fortescue Square. But he sat by her side in silence for a little while. "Frank," said his sister at last, "it is not like you to seek refuge in silence. I'm sorry if my chaff annoyed you. Don't forget that you know everything about this mysterious business, and I know very little." Her sympathetic voice roused him from the stupor which had benumbed his senses. "I allowed my imagination to run away with me, Sis," he said gently. "It was thoughtless on my part. Please forgive me. I suppose those two Chinamen are unofficially connected with the embassy. At any rate, the man with them, the little man in a blue serge suit and straw hat, is Furneaux of Scotland Yard, a pocket marvel among detectives, the sort of criminal hunter you read about in Gaboriau, but can scarcely accept as existing in real life." From that instant he bent his wits to the task of acquainting Mrs. Paxton with the history of the preceding 3 days. He was aware of the irrepressible trembling which shook her slender frame when he spoke of the ivory skull found in Edith Lester's under-bodice, and the replica of the same gruesome token sent to Forbes, so suppressed all mention of his own experiences on returning to Innismore Mansions overnight. Furneaux had asked him for the bit of ivory that morning, and incidentally had produced the others from his pocket. The detective gave no reason for his eagerness to possess these trophies, but seemed to invest them with great importance. While keeping up a constant flow of talk with his sister, Theydon tried to puzzle out the detective's motive for carrying such sinister messengers of death around London. Try as he might, he could arrive at no plausible explanation. But he did not make the error of attributing Furneaux's action to mere impulse. Those men of the Yard had a solid foundation for every step they took. Even the visit to Smith's Hotel and subsequent departure in the grey car meant a definite stride onward in the fight against Wong Li Fu. Of that he was assured. At 11 Fortescue Square there was no outward sign of recent disturbance, beyond the presence of a sharp-eyed policeman at each corner of the row-houses, of which Mr. Forbes's residence formed one of the centre pair. Theydon expected to see a shattered window in the drawing-room on the first floor, where presumably Mrs. Forbes was standing when the shot was fired. But each pane in the 3 large windows was intact, and the windows were closed. Then he reflected, as indeed proved to be the case, that on such a fine day the window would probably be open. 2 windows on the 2nd floor, and one in the cloak-room near the front door, were raised a few inches, but drawn curtains screened from observation any watchful eye which might be stationed behind them. As a matter of fact, armed detectives were hidden there, and they had been given specific orders to shoot, without warning, anyone of Chinese appearance whose behaviour was suspicious, while 3 men were in readiness in the hall to rush out into the square and make an arrest under similar circumstances. As yet, none of the other residents in the square had the remotest notion that number 11 was in a state of siege. The position of affairs, if it were not so desperate, was almost amusing. Mrs. Paxton and Theydon were admitted without any delay, and Forbes himself hurried downstairs to greet them. He was pale, but quite composed. All the nervous uncertainty of the previous day had vanished. He was armed and willing for the fray. If, as was by no means unlikely, Wang Li Fu staked everything on a gambler's throw, and led his cohort in a daylight raid on the house, the Manchu leader would meet with a very warm reception. Forbes was surprised to find that a lady had come with Theydon, but expressed his pleasure at the visit, which, he said, was just the thing his wife and Evelyn needed. "Yes," he went on cheerfully, noting the astonishment caused by his words, "Mrs. Forbes is not seriously injured. The bullet lacerated the top of her left shoulder, and the wound is painful but superficial. She positively refuses to remain in bed, so our doctor humoured her, provided she promises not to pass the time looking through the drawing-room window." Mrs. Paxton, to whose senses the presence of armed detectives and constables in uniform was even more eloquent than her brother's words, glanced about the spacious entrance hall with wide-eyed amazement. Once she and her brother were recognized as friends of the family, the men on duty gave them no heed. Outside were the familiar sounds of London traffic. Within were preparations for conflict. The police carried revolvers openly in leather cases strapped to their belts. On a table near the library door were several automatic pistols, ready to be snatched up in an emergency. An alert detective, revolver in hand, was peering through the curtains of the cloak-room. This sentry, in particular, would alarm the garrison if, as Winter had definitely warned his assistants, an attempt were ever made to enter the house by main force. "I think I must be dreaming," she said, trying bravely to lessen the gravity of the statement by smiling at its inherent absurdity. "Am I in London, or have I been whisked by magic to one of those outposts of civilization where men and women of European race are often compelled to band together for protection against savages? One reads of such things comfortably while dawdling over breakfast, and one wonders idly why people go to such places. But that something of the sort could happen in London, why, it is simply fantastic." "It is unpleasantly real for all that, Mrs. Paxton," said Forbes, leading the way upstairs. "What else can we do? If the authorities surrounded the house with a cordon of soldiers, London would be in an uproar. We want to avoid that at all costs. I have been in communication with the Home Office, and am advised that if we decide to put up with the inconvenience, it is better, and actually less risky, to hold out here than seek safety by flight. I understand that Scotland Yard is not losing an unnecessary minute, but there are obvious difficulties in the way of decisive action. It is considered worse than useless to effect isolated arrests, as these tend only to put the other members of the gang on their guard. The chief inspector tells me that he had some hope of being able to make a big haul tonight. The principal drawback is the language barrier. Chinese interpreters are few and far between in London, and those who do exist, in the East End, for instance, have long since lost any useful acquaintance with events in their own country. This is a political matter, you understand, and must be fought out on political lines. Strange as it may sound in your ears, the cause of Chinese freedom is at issue in this very house. If Wang Li-fu could secure a list of the names now locked in a bureau in my library, the constitutional party in China would perish forthwith for want of leaders. But he won't get it. Thanks to your brother, Mrs. Paxton, his deadliest attack failed yesterday. For today's accident we have ourselves to blame. We did not even suspect that his malignity would take the form of shooting the first person who chanced to look out of a window. He had halted at the top of the broad staircase while making that stirring declaration of war. "Pardon my outspokenness," he said, sinking his voice to a lower tone. "I don't want to frighten my wife on my own account. She believes now that the police are hunting these scoundrels in every hole and corner of London. In a sense, that is true, but we never know the moment some extraordinary action may be taken, so we remain constantly on the qui-vive." He heard the telephone ring beneath, and turned quickly. "I may be wanted," he said. "I'll join you presently. There is my wife's boudoir," and he pointed to a door. "Take Mrs. Paxton in, Theydon. Mrs. Forbes and Evelyn will be glad of your company." Theydon knocked, and heard Evelyn's voice bidding him enter. Mrs. Forbes was lying on a couch, and her daughter had evidently been seated near her, reading a newspaper. "I've brought my sister to see you," he explained. "I've been relating such heroic things about you that she simply refused to go home without ocular proof of your existence." Mrs. Forbes would have risen, but was restrained by the girl's emphatic cry, "Mother, why won't you behave like an obedient invalid?" Thus coerced, Mother did behave. "They insist on treating me as a casualty," she cried cheerfully. "What is your sister's name, Mr. Theydon?" "Molly," he said thoughtlessly, for he had just touched Evelyn Forbes's hand, and the mere contact gave him an electrical shock. The women laughed, and Mrs. Paxton blushed. "Molly Paxton, at any rate," she said, realizing at once that her brother had completely lost all self-possession at sight of his divinity. "Now, as you are going to stay here, Frank, you shall give me the full measure of the few minutes I can spare. So go and talk over your adventures with Mr. Forbes, while I gossip with the prisoners." Theydon saw that his tactful sister had struck the right note. She might be trusted to make herself eminently agreeable. Her bright, smiling manner had already created a good impression, and a lively chat with one who had not passed through the vicissitudes which beset the Forbes family would be an excellent tonic. "Before I efface myself, may I be allowed to congratulate Mrs. Forbes on her escape?" he said, halting at the door. "Yes, you may," replied the older lady. "And just to show that I am convalescent, kindly tell Tomlinson that I am coming down to luncheon, and that Mrs. Paxton will join us." Forbes was leaving the telephone when Theydon regained the hall, and explained that he had been dismissed from the feminine conclave upstairs. The millionaire closed the door and motioned his companion to a chair. "How long will it be before London wakes up to the knowledge of what's going on in its midst?" he said. "Is there anything in the newspapers? I have had no time to read. I passed a rather sleepless night, so did not rise until a late hour. Then Helena was fired at. I need hardly tell you that my time has been fully occupied since." Theydon gave a résumé of the paragraph which had appeared in at least one of the morning journals, and admitted that some inkling of the truth was bound to gain publicity during the next few hours. "I cannot understand why it is the reporters are not here by the score already," he went on. "Some passer-by must have seen or heard the shooting. A pistol cannot be fired in a quiet square like this without attracting general attention." "That is the extraordinary part of it," said Forbes, smiling grimly. "People heard the noise, of course, but came to the conclusion that a cylinder in the car had backfired. That was the view taken by two policemen on duty within a few yards of the house. A detective stationed in the cloakroom actually saw the man raising the weapon. He, of course, was under no delusion as to what had happened, and ran out instantly. But the car was then travelling at a fast pace, and was out of sight before the nearest constable could even endeavour to stop it. Anyhow, what was the man to do? We cannot expect that he would whip out a revolver, if he carries one, and blaze away indiscriminately at car and occupants, if the chauffeur refuses to pull up. Really, Theydon, Wang Li Fu has perplexed the authorities more than any desperado known to this generation. He is aware that his hostage has escaped from Croydon, so he calmly drives past my house, knowing full well that it is efficiently guarded, and fires a pot-shot at the first person seen through one of the windows. The man whom I have spoken to over the telephone shares that opinion. He is one of the legal advisers to the Home Office. Just to show the baffling nature of the problem, he says that it will be absolutely impossible, on the evidence available at present, to frame a charge against any Chinaman other than Wang Li Fu. Yet we know that he has at least 4 or 5, and probably 3 times as many accomplices. Have the police yet obtained any real clue as to the whereabouts of the gang's headquarters? They must have some sort of meeting place. They must eat and sleep somewhere. That big detective, Winter, came here this morning. He seemed to be very confident, though I think I gave him the worst shock he has received for many a year when I informed him that within an hour after he had left the house Mrs. Forbes had been shot at, and narrowly escaped a fatal wound. It was he who asked me to invite you to come here. I'm exceedingly sorry that our acquaintance, begun so happily, should involve you in personal risk." "As for that," broke in Theydon, "I would not change places with any man in England at this moment." He feared instantly that he might have said too much, and added with a laugh, "Don't forget, Mr. Forbes, that I write books. Some of them, the most popular ones, I am afraid, being of a sensational type. When this tornado has died down, and Wang Li Fu is carefully hanged, and you and your family are recuperating in Sutherlandshire, I shall resume work with a new inspiration. Never again shall I say to myself, "Oh, that is too far-fetched," or fear that I am straining my reader's credulity beyond bounds. If a small gang of Chinamen and Japanese can hold up London, bamboozle the best men in Scotland Yard, and keep a man of your position a prisoner in his own house, I need have no fear of adopting any situation my fertile brain can evolve, because 4 days ago I would have scoffed at the things which have actually happened as quite impossible, and therefore unbelievable. Japanese, you say? Why do you mention Japanese? The American, Mr. Handyside, tells me the skulls are of Japanese workmanship. He argues also that the wrestling tricks, of which Winter and I, and Mrs. Forbes in lesser degree, have had some experience, are Japanese. More than that, a Jap was arrested outside my place early this morning. Mr. Winter said something about it, but he spoke only of Chinamen. I have Furneaux's authority for the statement that the prisoner is a Jap, and belongs to a society calling itself the Sons of Nippon. But confound it, I have no quarrel with Japan. If anything, I am one of her best friends. I must get Handyside to propound one of his favourite theories. He says that a powerful and growing party among our allies in the Far East means to keep China in a condition of anarchy until Japan is prepared, financially and in armament, to take a commanding share in the ultimate settlement. But at best, the few Japanese adventurers in league with Wang Li Fu hardly count. Once he is laid by the heels, this feud will evaporate into thin air. If it doesn't, I must ask the government to provide safe quarters for my family in the Tower, muttered Forbes, rising and pacing the room in the same thoughtful, care-laden way as he had paced it when Theydon first told him of Edith Lester's end. You said Wang Li Fu knew that Mrs. Forbes had been rescued from her bonds last night, went on Theydon. I suppose Winter told you that. Was he only assuming the fact, or have there been developments at Croydon? A motor car drove up to the gate openly at 10 o'clock this morning. A police sergeant, jumping to the conclusion that one of his own chiefs, or a representative of Scotland Yard, was paying the place a visit, incautiously showed himself in the doorway, whereupon the car raced away. It was an unfortunate and perhaps costly blunder, but the man is hardly to be blamed. The very audacity of the gang is their best safeguard. A luncheon gong clanged in the hall. Both men started, and then laughed. "You see," cried Forbes, "these rascals have got us on the jump. I don't know how long my servants will stand the racket. They are most loyal, and Tomlinson vows that not a syllable has been breathed outside by any of our domestics. But the women's nerves are on edge. A scullery maid dropped a decanter a little while since, and the crash drew blood-curdling shrieks from the kitchen. Come, let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." The quotation is not a felicitous one. Indeed, it is distinctly ominous, but it seems to meet the conditions. He threw open the door and saw the three ladies descending the stairs. "Helena," he cried sternly, "the doctor said you were not to stir out of your room." "My dear, the doctor is a mere man, and fancies that a woman is not fitted for warfare. He is quite mistaken. When aroused, we can be terrible." Mrs. Forbes, whose face was paler and eyes seemingly bigger and more luminous than usual, was leaning on Evelyn's arm. She was dressed in a blue tulle costume, which lent a fragile air to an already slender form, but she smiled so unaffectedly that even the policeman grinned. "You certainly look ferocious," said her husband, yielding instantly, as she well knew would happen. "I believe you are all jealous," she vowed. "I am the only one who has really been in the forefront of the battle. No, I forgot you, Mr. Theydon. Didn't that horrid man knock you down?" "Yes," said Theydon, moistening his lips with his tongue. There was such a peculiar rasp in his voice that it evoked a general laugh. Obviously, the guests meant to avoid serious topics during the meal. Evelyn Forbes chimed in with a reminiscence of her school days in Brussels, and soon the talk was general, ranging from the year's academy to the ladies' golf championship. Mrs. Paxton, an excellent mimic, was amusing them with imitations of the voice and manner of a certain well-known lady golfer, when she was interrupted by 3 sharp, irregular cracks, which seemed to come from the dining-room windows. Simultaneously, a picture frame on the opposite wall was split, and a Worcester vase on a sideboard was smashed to atoms. Theydon, owing to his position at the table, was the first to notice 3 small, starred holes in the plate glass of the windows. "Don't stand up," he said instantly. "Some one is shooting at the house. Crouch on the floor, for heaven's sake." That urgent appeal was emphasized by a 4th bullet, which, taking a lower flight, barely missed Forbes, upset a Venetian glass flower vase on the table, and buried itself in the lower half of the sideboard. Forbes, heedless of the possible consequences to himself, sprang to his wife's assistance, and, interposing his body as a shield between her and the windows, led her to an angle of the wall where she would be safe. The younger women, after a momentary hesitation, dropped to the floor and crawled to the same refuge. Theydon ran out. The front door was open. The police had heard the shooting, the sound of which had been deadened to those in the dining-room by the breaking glass and china. But within a few minutes a useless pursuit was abandoned. The fusillade had come from a car which halted close to the garden railings on the far side of the square. Though the trees were nearly in full leaf, and dense shrubberies seemed to shut off every house from any such method of attack, investigation proved that it was possible to estimate accurately the position of the dining-room windows in number 11. When Theydon returned, he found Forbes and the ladies gathered in the hall. "Another narrow escape on both sides," he said coolly. 2 policemen were just too late to interfere. Of course, they did not anticipate a move in that quarter. "Have the enemy made off in a car?" said Mrs. Forbes. "Yes, a constable in a taxi is trying to follow them." "Well, then, let us finish our luncheon. I had hardly touched my cutlet." "By Jove, Helena, that doctor of ours was decidedly in error," cried her husband. "You're right. If we're besieged, we must carry ourselves according to the code. Mrs. Paxton, I hope it won't disturb you if a shell bursts before coffee is served?" Theydon glanced through a window before resuming his seat. "That volley has done things," he announced. "London is stirring at last. There's a crowd in front of the house, and a short, fat man is explaining the procedure. Prepare now to receive the press in battalions." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of number 17 by Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wherein unexpected allies appear. Although, as shall be seen, the final and complete defeat and extinction of the London section of the young Manchus were directly due to forces set in motion by Furneaux, it was Winter's painstaking way of covering the ground that unearthed the fraternity's meeting place, and thus brought matters to a head speedily. For the rest, events followed their own course, and great would have been the fame of the prophet who predicted that course accurately. In later days, when more ample knowledge was available, it was a debatable point whether or not the inmates of number 11 Fortescue Square were saved from an almost maniacal vengeance by the fact that a crisis was precipitated. Winter maintained stoutly that the police must triumph in the long run, whereas Furneaux held with even greater tenacity that although the gang would undoubtedly be broken up, that much-desired end might have been attained after, and not before, a dire tragedy occurred in the Forbes household. The pros and cons of the argument were equally numerous and weighty. They cannot be marshalled here. Each man and woman who reads this record will probably form an emphatic opinion tending towards the one side or the other. All that a veracious chronicler can accomplish is to set forth a plain tale of events in their proper sequence, and leave the ultimate verdict to individual judgment. Winter was a hard-headed, broad-minded official whose long and wide experience enabled him to estimate at their true value the far-reaching powers of the state, as opposed to the machinations of a few determined outlaws. On the other hand, the amazing facility with which Furneaux could enter into the twists and turns of the criminal mind entitles his matured views to much respect. At any rate, this is what happened. Winter was sitting in his office, smoking a fat cigar, wading through reports brought in by subordinates concerning every opium den and Chinese boarding-house in the East End, when Furneaux entered. "Any luck?" inquired the chief, laying aside one document which seemed to merit fuller inquiry. It described a club much frequented by Chinese residents in London, men of a higher class than the sailors and firemen brought to the port by ships trading with the Far East. And an outstanding feature of the young Manchu's operations was the intelligent grasp of the ways and means of modern civilized life these filibusters exhibited. "So," squeaked Furneaux. He flung himself into a big armchair, curled up in it like an animated Buddha, and extracted one of the 3 ivory skulls from a waistcoat pocket. "If you could only speak, you image of evil," he muttered. "You're not so dead that you cannot work mischief. Why the deuce, then, can't you mouth your incantations? Then we would listen and learn." Winter, still sorting his papers, cocked the cigar inquisitively on one side of his mouth. "Oh, I have ascertained a lot about the inner politics of China," mumbled Furneaux irritably, gazing fixedly at the skull, after one quick glance at his colleague. "Every little helps, of course. I have met some Chinamen this morning who would cheerfully plunge Wang Li Fu into a cauldron of boiling oil and stir him round with a long stick when he was in it. One man, quite an important personage in the jute line, has lost a brother and a brother-in-law, the one in Canton, the other in Pekin, and he lays both deaths at the door of the redoubtable Wang. Another, the fellow who chanced to take up his quarters at Smith's Hotel, is a delegate sent here specially to hunt out Wang and destroy him. I asked him how he meant to set about it, but his scheme is vague. He's an opportunist of the first water. Me catchy and killy Wang Li Fu one time was his best effort. I'm going to confront Len Shi with these two in Bow Street. They may worm something out of him, but will they own up if they do? Dashed if I know. The Oriental mind is on a par with their blessed language. It has 3,000 ways of expressing one idea, and not one of 'em is our way. Has Theydon gone to Fortescue Square? I suppose so. He turned up in Jermyn Street, outside Smith's Hotel, if you please, with a lady in a taxi. A lady, Miss Beale? No, his sister, judging from the family likeness. His eyes grew goggled like yours when he saw the grey car. Didn't you explain the matter? Not I. Gave him the cut direct. My Chinamen are shy birds, and I daren't flutter them by letting them think there are too many foreign devils mixed up in this business. My London Chinaman was the brainy person who got the embassy busy when Mrs. Lester's death was announced. He saw Wang Li Fu's hand in that from the first moment. Oddly enough, though he and a man from the embassy followed Theydon from Waterloo to Forbes's place on Tuesday night, and again to Innismore Mansions, he didn't recognize him today. Or perhaps he did. I don't know. Talk about the impassive Red Indian. A thoroughbred Chink would give a Pawnee chief one glass eye and a coat of paint, and then beat him hollow at the haughty indifference game. My, said Winter admiringly, you've got your tongue loose today. Well, here's an item which should prove useful. Whitechapel thinks we may find a young Manchu or two among that collection. And he threw an official memorandum across the table. Furneaux repocketed the skull, and was gazing moodily at the report, when a uniformed constable announced that a boy messenger wished to see a detective with regard to the typed letter delivered at Mr. Forbes's house on Wednesday evening. Show him up, said the chief, and a smart-looking boy, wearing the familiar uniform of his corps, was brought in. He glanced around inquiringly. "Oh, you're the gentleman who came to our Piccadilly office," he said to Winter. "Yes." "Well, sir, I haven't much to tell you, but it was I who took the letter to Fortescue Square. I saw the sender, a foreign-looking gentleman, with funny eyes, and I think I spotted him again this afternoon. He was coming out of a house in Charlotte Street." "Are you sure?" demanded Winter, quickly. "He was awfully like the man who engaged me, sir, and dressed the same way." "Did you notice the number of the house?" "Yes, sir, number 412. "Quite certain about that?" "Yes, sir." "Good boy. If your information is of any service, I'll take care you're not forgotten." The boy saluted and went out. "We must look up number 412, said Winter quietly. But there was a ring of genuine satisfaction in his voice. because the clue promised well, and it was a complete justification of the straightforward method he adopted in every inquiry, whereas Furneaux invariably preferred an abstruse theory to a definite piece of evidence. The Jersey man's face had wrinkled as a preliminary to some sarcastic comment on what he termed the handcuff way of reasoning, when the telephone bell rang and Winter answered, and at once his self-possessed air fled. Indeed, it was a very angry man who listened, because a subordinate was telephoning from Fortescue Square a full account of the shooting outrage. The chief gave a few curt instructions as to securing the adequate cooperation of the local police, who should take measures to render any repetition of such daring acts absolutely impossible. "No one was injured, you say?" he added. "No, sir." "Were the ladies very much frightened?" "They've gone back to finish luncheon, sir." "Good. Evidently they're all of the right breed. You can tell them I said so. Assure Mr. Forbes that every care will be taken to protect his house in future. See that such strong patrols occupy every point from which a gun can be aimed at any window, even in the attics. Phone me again when you have discussed matters with the district superintendent." The receiver clanged back into its hook. Winter had not foreseen this latest move. Sheer impudence, he termed it. "More bullets?" inquired Furneaux laconically. "Yes, a long-range attack from across the square. 4 shots lodged in the dining-room." "No one hurt, and no one arrested?" "Not a soul." "James," said the little man solemnly, "Wang Li Fu is making us a laughing-stock. Are you aware that the newspapers will get on our track now? Can't you see the headlines? Another Sydney Street. Chinese pirates busy in London. Scotland Yard outwitted. By this time tomorrow the Commissioner will be suggesting that you and I ought to think about retiring on pensions." Winter jumped up, overturning a chair in his haste. "Come," he said, "if that Chinaman in Bow Street won't speak, I'll torture him. What of the other fellow who was caught near Innismore Mansions?" "He's a Jap. He knows nothing. He was hired for the job, to put any interfering bobby to sleep." The chief inspector angrily bundled some papers into a drawer and threw away his cigar, which he had allowed to go out. Furneaux produced an ivory skull again and scowled at it, whereupon his superior, snorting with annoyance, strode to the window and affected an interest he was far from feeling in the panorama of the Thames. And thus they passed a harmonious quarter of an hour, which came to an end with the appearance of an attendant to announce the arrival of 2 Chinese gentlemen to see Mr. Furneaux. They went down in the elevator without exchanging a word. At the entrance stood the grey car, in which the Chinamen were already seated. Furneaux introduced the chief inspector, and they were whisked to Bow Street. There, in a cell, they found Len Shi, a somewhat sullen-looking man, whose European chauffeur's livery seemed curiously raffish and unsuitable when contrasted with the more picturesque, if sober-hued, garments worn by his fellow countrymen. At first he maintained the sulky know-nothing role, which he had adopted successfully with the official interpreter. Furneaux, watching the faces of prisoner and questioners, guessed that small progress was being made. So, waiting until Len Shi was evidently quite satisfied with himself, he suddenly thrust an ivory skull before the man's eyes. The result was unexpected, but puzzling. The man was badly scared, beyond doubt, but he now became obstinately silent. Winter, than whom no living actor could play up better to Furneaux's tactics in a touch-and-go encounter of this sort, assumed a highly tragic air. "Handcuff that man and bring him out," said the constable in charge of the cells. Len Shi blanched. He estimated the legal methods of Great Britain by those which obtained in his own land, and probably thought he was being led forth to immediate execution. The whole 5 crowded into the car, and the driver, the same English chauffeur to whom Theydon had spoken, was told to make for 412 Charlotte Street, and pass the house slowly but not pull up. Len Shi, though quaking with alarm, bore himself with a certain dignified stoicism until he found out where the car was apparently stopping. Then he asked something in a panic-stricken voice, and the jute merchant, who spoke fluent English, turned to Furneaux. "Tell the chauffeur to return," he said. "Len Shi will now confess." Once started, Len Shi talked volubly, and the detectives curbed their impatience as best they might, until Len Shi was safely lodged in Bow Street again. Then Winter led his Chinese helpers into an inner office and closed the door. "Well," he said, addressing the jute merchant. The other Chinaman had very little English, and could not maintain a conversation. But to the Chief Inspector's surprise and wrath, the English-speaking Chinaman had only a request to make. "Give me and my friends those 3 ivory skulls," he said. "Why?" "Without them we can accomplish nothing." "Be good enough to explain yourself. Above all, tell me what Len Shi has been jabbering about. He had plenty to say." "He told us of the fate of our friends in China. Those things do not concern you. What you want is to have Wang Li Fu and the others, there are nearly 20 in all, delivered into your hands. Very well. Give us those ivory skulls, and bring your men to that house in Charlotte Street at 1 o'clock this night, and you will take them back without a blow being struck." "That is our business, you know, not yours," said Winter, gruffly, decisively. "I cannot expose you 2 gentlemen to any personal risk in this affair." "You do not understand," broke in the jute merchant, addressing Winter as if he were a fractious child who must be informed as to the why and wherefore of a disagreeable duty. "What will you do? Surround the house with policemen? Break in doors and fight? You may or may not succeed. Plenty of your men will be killed, certainly. That is not good. We do not wish it. Give me those skulls. I and my friend will go there, will admit you. Then you take Wang Li Fu and all the others. There will be no fight." The Chinaman's manner was singularly impressive as he tapped 3 times on a high desk to emphasize, as it were, his instructions. The sound, too, was curious. He did not use his knuckles, but bunched the fingers of his right hand together and rapped on the wood with the long nails, which are a mark of distinction in his race. "We make things easy and certain for you," he added, more by way of painstaking argument than because any further explanation was really necessary. "You do not wish to fail, no? You want to be sure that Wang Di Fu's evil deeds shall be stopped. Good. We do that, I and my friend. We can pass the doorkeepers. Can you? No. At 1 o'clock we open the door, and the young Manchus will be wholly in your power to do what you will with them. I promise that, and my word is always taken in the city." Winter turned troubled eyes on Furneaux. "What do you say?" he muttered irresolutely. "I think the plan is a good one, and should be adopted," was the instant reply. Nevertheless, Winter was perplexed. He hemmed and hawed a good deal. Seldom did he hesitate in this fashion. As a rule, he was quick to decide and quicker to act. "I might entertain your scheme if I were told more about it," he said dubiously, gazing with troubled eyes at the Chinaman's blandly inscrutable face. "Please believe me when I say that I trust your good faith. But I am not sure that even you understand fully the nature of the adventure you have in mind. Wang Li Fu has already committed one murder in London. He has attempted others, and is absolutely careless of consequences. How can I have any guarantee that you and this other gentleman may not be his next victims? He is a person who displays a somewhat forced humour. We might enter the Charlotte Street house at 1 o'clock, and find your corpses there, with labels and ivory skulls neatly attached." "That will not be so," was the grave answer. "If I agree, what time do you propose going there?" "About midnight." "And do you expect the police to leave the whole neighbourhood severely alone for another hour?" "Not unless you wish it. If you so desire, you can occupy both ends of the street, and arrest every Chinaman coming away from number 412. But let those pass who go towards it." "Will others go there? Friends of yours, I mean?" "Oh, yes. We will overpower the young Manchus by taking them unaware. We will act quietly, but there will be no mistake. It is you who will err if you do not accept our help." Then Winter yielded, though not with a good grace. The implied suggestion that the London police could not handle a set of Mongolian ruffians was utterly distasteful. Yet he admitted, though unwillingly, that he did not want to sacrifice some of his best men in rushing the place. "All right," he said. "Hand over the skulls, Furneaux. It is quite agreed," he went on, addressing the Chinaman again, "that I have full liberty of action in so far as preliminary arrangements are concerned. I see your point, that Wang Li Fu must not be forewarned, and shall take care that my men are hidden. I have your positive assurance, too, that you are not exposing your own life in any way. To the best of my belief, I shall be as safe in Charlotte Street as I am here," said the jute merchant, smiling for the first time during the interview. "1, 2, 3, said Furneaux, counting the skulls into the Chinaman's outstretched hand. For some reason, the action, no less than the words, jarred on Winter. "I do wish you wouldn't be so d theatrical," he growled. Furneaux said nothing. He accompanied the chief inspector when the latter escorted the two Chinamen to their car, and whistled softly between his teeth while Winter and he were walking to Scotland Yard. The big man glowered at him once or twice, but passed no comment. When they reached the Embankment, Winter took Furneaux to his room, but left him instantly. He was absent a long time. When he came in again, he was cheerfully placid. Walking toward their favourite restaurant in Soho, they met a newsboy, running with an edition of an evening newspaper damp from the press. The boy was shouting, "Horrible crime in the West End. Chinese outrage." Furneaux bought a paper. It contained a lively account of the attack on Mr. Forbes's house, and described the mansion as an armed fortress. Scores of police were parading the neighbourhood and examining every passing motor car, lest it held Chinese bandits. The arrest of Len Shi at St. Albans and of a Japanese outside the Innismore mansions was recalled, and an Eastbourne correspondent had sent a fairly accurate version of the kidnapping of Mrs. Forbes. "The pack is in full cry now, James," grinned Furneaux. "Tomorrow? Oh, bother tomorrow. Let's eat and talk about something else." "What, both? Well, now, if that isn't a bit of luck," cried a pleasant voice close behind them, and Mr. George T. Handyside held out his two hands. "I was feeling kind of lonesome in the hotel, and just strolled out to look at the shops," he rattled on. "Say, can you boys eat a line? Is there a place in London where they know what a planked steak is?" "Planked steak?" snorted Furneaux. "When you've tasted a porterhouse steak grilled by master hand, you'll never mention any other variety again. Come right along, Mr. Handyside. Tell us fairy tales about God's own country. We're in the right mood to believe anything." "But what's this story of another shooting up in Fortescue Square? Is it true?" Then Furneaux dug him in the ribs. "This isn't the wild and woolly West. This is London, sir. Poor, played-out London, whose beefy citizens do nothing but eat, talk cricket or golf, and sleep. If you credit the newspapers, you will never get us in the right perspective." Another newspaper boy raced past, bawling loudly. "All a flam, is it?" said the American quizzically. "No," said Winter. "It's the truth, and less than the truth. Let's hunt that steak, and we'll season the dish for you." Winter never erred when he chose a man as a friend. He liked Handyside, and was half inclined to drop a hint in his ear as to the night's programme, for the American had seen Wang Li Fu more than once, and might be useful for identification purposes. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Number 17 by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Settlement. Now, Len Shi had communicated one vital fact to his compatriots, which they had carefully concealed from the detectives. The opening campaign against Forbes had practically ended that day. Thenceforth, for a week, the young Manchus meant to separate, revert to Chinese costume, live in Chinese boarding houses in the East End, and thus utterly mislead and bamboozle the police, who, in their hunt for the miscreants, would be searching for Chinamen in European dress and living in European style. Winter was in two minds whether or not to inform the inmates of number 11 as to the contemplated raid on the Charlotte Street rendezvous. Ultimately, he decided to say nothing definite that evening. It was better that the threatened people and their guards should not relax their vigilance. The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang aft agley. And if perchance the jute merchant's plan, whatever it might be, miscarried, and some of the desperadoes escaped, they would be stirred to instant reprisals. But there was no semblance of doubt or hesitation about the measures taken by the police. That night, from 11 o'clock onward, not even a prowling cat entered Charlotte Street without being seen by sharp eyes. Nearly opposite to number 412 was a large warehouse, with a back entrance, a long way in the rear, and approached from another street. At midnight, 3 Chinamen appeared, turned into Charlotte Street from the south, and shuffled on noiseless feet straight to number 414. They knocked, and after some delay were admitted. A minute later, 3 others came from the north, knocked on the door of number 410, and disappeared, the delay seemingly caused by a parley with someone within being longer in this instance. Afterward, squads of Chinamen, exactly 25 all told, came from north and south in practically equal numbers and entered those 2 houses, but never a man entered or passed or came out of number 412. These more numerous arrivals met with no hesitation on the part of the 2 doorkeepers. They entered without let or hindrance. After that, there was what is known in theatrical circles as a stage wait. Charlotte Street, save for its loafers and an occasional belated resident of some dwelling other than those under observation, lapsed into its normal and utterly dismal gloom. From 12:30 onwards, Winter, stationed on the south side, looked at his watch many a time. A little man, mingling with the disreputable rascals on the north side, was similarly fidgety. A tall, slim man, wearing a dark overcoat, who lurked in a doorway near Winter's post, blew the tip of the cigar he was smoking into a red glow, so that he might look at his watch. Another tall man, rather more powerfully built, awaited developments with apparent unconcern. Mr. Handyside, in fact, was in the august company of the Commissioner of Police, and the latter, though eminently agreeable, nevertheless observed an Olympian attitude. Thus might Jove watch a gathering in the Pompeic way. At 12:45 there was a stir. Out of 410 and 414 came 25 Chinamen. They gathered on the pavement, and did not attempt to walk away, though a sudden and concentrated advance was made by the 2 sets of loafers, while the doors of the warehouse opposite belched forth a startling array of constables in uniform. Winter and Furneaux, respectively, headed the contingents from north and south. An inspector was in charge of the central body, and even a Chinaman who had not been a day in London must have realized that the intent of these swift-moving detachments was to cut off his escape if he meant flight. But not a Chinaman budged, save one who seemed to recognize the chief inspector, because he stepped forward and said in suave tones, "These men are my friends. The others are inside. They are quite safe. Kindly wait till 1 o'clock. I must understand what you mean, Mr. Li Chang, said Winter sternly. For some reason he distrusted the smooth-spoken jute merchant. Why have you visited these 2 houses, and not 412? And what do we gain by waiting here any longer? We must have been seen, and our purpose guessed. No, came the surprising answer. No one in number 412 is aware of your presence. We have taken care of that. As for the other houses, they provide the simplest means of access to the center one. Doorways have been made in the cellar walls, and special staircases built. Consequently, if you broke open the door of 412, you would find the way barred by 2 other locked doors, while the occupants, if aroused, could escape from either or both of the next houses. We Chinese have a long acquaintance with the needs of a secret society. You may take it from me that the obvious way into or out of an opium den, for instance, is never the way used by the habitué. By this time the commissioner, Handyside, Furneaux, and the inspector had come up, and the 5 formed a little group in the centre of a semicircle of detectives and police. There was absolutely no sign of life in any of the houses. Save for the raiders and the stolid Orientals, the street itself was deserted. Many eyes, no doubt, were peering through darkened windows, but the denizens of Charlotte Street, as a rule, attend strictly to their own personal affairs when the police are in evidence. What do you advise, sir? Said Winter, addressing the commissioner. Mr. Li Chang wants us to make no move until 1 o'clock. It is only a matter of 6 or 7 minutes. And what then? Are we to enter these other houses, and not 412? Yes, said the Chinaman. Have you left the doors open? No, they must be forced. But there are only small locks. The bolts are drawn. The places are apparently in complete darkness. My men must use their lamps, and may be attacked. No, said Li Chang simply. There will be no fighting. Those Manchu dogs are helpless. We have seen to that. But how? Do you mean that they are stupefied? Bound, said the Chinaman. Tied, hand and foot. Again, then, may I ask, why wait? It will be in order, was the calm reply. I entered into an arrangement with you. I want to abide by it. Winter breathed heavily. The ways of the Oriental were not his ways. But a bargain was a bargain, so what more could be said? Suddenly, about 2 minutes to 1 o'clock, a curious crackling noise was heard. A column of sparks burst high above the steep roof of number 412, and the upper windows of the opposite houses reflected a red glare. Good heavens! The place is on fire! Cried Winter. Simultaneously came a shout from both ends of the street. Men were running from the detachment guarding the rear of the premises to say that a fierce fire was raging on the first floor back of number 412. Smash in those 3 doors, cried Winter to his helpers. Drag out every Chinaman you meet. Handcuff them in 3s and 4s. Arrest these fellows standing outside, but keep the 2 lots separate. Why are we, your friends, to be arrested? Demanded Li Chang's dignified voice. I'll soon tell you why, you slim demon, shouted the chief inspector, roused to anger by the consciousness that he had been duped. What fiendish trick have you played on those wretches penned up inside there? But I'll soon know. He turned to the local officer. "Better march this crowd of Chinamen straight to your station," he said. "I'll follow soon and lay a charge." He felt a claw-like hand on his arm, and, wild with vexation though he was, forced himself to listen. "We are ready to go where you wish," said Li Cheng calmly. "But spare your own men. They must not enter 412. They will be blown to pieces. Stop them. I shall not warn you twice." Somehow Winter was impelled to obey. The centre door was already yielding, but he rushed forward and told the party which meant to enter at that point to abandon it and reinforce their comrades. A number of detectives and police were already inside the dark hallways of numbers 410 and 414, when the very walls trembled under the shock of a violent explosion in number 412, which was quickly followed by 3 others. A tongue of flame darted instantly to a height of many feet above the topmost story, showing that the series of explosions had not only destroyed the whole rear section of the house, and thus given the fire fresh fuel and plenty of space, but there could be no reasonable doubt that the bombs, if bombs they were, had themselves been filled with some highly inflammable substance. Thenceforth the police could do nothing beyond keeping at a distance the crowds which soon gathered, and thus clear a space for the operations of the fire brigade. Number 412 was thoroughly gutted. Not a shred of the building remained, except the crumbling walls at front and back. Its neighbours were in a little better case, and the firemen devoted their efforts mainly toward keeping the disaster within bounds. One thing was certain. No human being had escaped from out of that doomed habitation. The fire, too, had gained hold with a phenomenal rapidity, which argued the use of petrol, or some kindred agent of irresistible potency, when ignited. Winter and Furneaux, accompanied by the Commissioner and Mr. Handyside, walked to the local police station. The American was the only one who spoke. "Queer ducks, the Chinese," he said, seemingly musing aloud rather than inviting comment. "They like to settle their own differences. I guess we'd feel pretty much like that if we lived in China." No one took up the point thus raised. Winter bent a searching, almost sorrowful glance at Furneaux, but the little man's eyes were fixed on the ground, as though he were deep in thought. In the charge room of the police station, the 25 Chinamen awaited them. 25 pairs of oblique eyes gleamed at the 4 when they entered, but not a word was spoken. Winter, of course, singled out Li Cheng for a parley. "Now," he said, "tell me just what happened after you and these others went into the 2 houses in Charlotte Street." The Chinaman faced him imperturbably. His manner was as unemotional, and his words as slow and methodical, as if he were selling jute in his East End warehouse. "We asked to be admitted, and, after giving the password and showing the sign, there was no difficulty," he said. "We were in parties of 3. As you probably saw, I headed one, which entered number 410. My friend, Wan Lung Fu, led the other. The ivory skulls made matters simple. We explained to the doorkeepers that we had just arrived from China, and brought messages of great urgency. Once inside, we gagged and bound the doorkeepers. Then we entered number 412, where we knew that Wang Li Fu would be smoking opium with the remaining 14. Were there 17 in the gang, all told?" broke in Furneaux. 17 Manchus. The rest are paid men of no account." "Queer," muttered Furneaux, almost to himself. "The story begins and ends with the number 17. Again Winter did strive to pierce his colleague with a look from those bulging eyes, but the little man was far too occupied with a singular numerical coincidence to pay any heed to him. "Well, go on," he said impatiently, glaring at the Chinaman. "We went to the big room at the back," continued Li Chung quietly, uttering each word separately, and evidently weighing it in his mind to test its accuracy before use, "and found Wang Li Fu. Him we bound quickly and very securely. The others we tied in 2s and 3s. Of course, we brought the 2 doorkeepers to the same room, so that you should experience no difficulty, but take them all together." Here Mr. Wan Lung Fu broke in. Evidently he could follow the English better than speak it. "Yes," he said, "we wanty you catchy Chinymans all together, muchy wanty." Then he smiled blandly, and his tongue rolled over his lips as though some fruit or sweetmeat had left a pleasant taste there. "Then, if your surprise was so successful, what caused the fire?" said Winter, affecting a magnificent disregard of the plain facts. Li Chung, for once, permitted his immobile features to show some semblance of anxious uncertainty. "That," he said, "is a mystery which can, perhaps, never be solved. But it saves your government much trouble." In those few words he expressed quite clearly the line he had adhered to throughout a long cross-examination. Neither Winter nor the Commissioner could shake him. The fire was an accident, the outcome of an extraordinary chance. He knew nothing whatsoever of its origin. After a protracted debate in private between the 2 heads of the Criminal Investigation Department, the names and addresses of the prisoners were recorded, and they were set at liberty. Before Li Chung went away, Furneaux demanded the return of the 3 ivory skulls, which were promptly handed over. "One word in your ear. Did Wang Li Fu recognize you?" "Oh, yes," said the Chinaman. "And you spoke to him?" "Oh, yes." The eyes of the 2 clashed. For once, Furneaux peered deep into the mind of an Oriental, and what he saw there kept him quiet. But he knew, just as surely as if he had been present, exactly what Li Chung said to Wang Li Fu. He delivered a message from 2 graves in far-off China. And that is all. Or nearly all. The Charlotte Street fire caused only a slight sensation. It became known that number 412 was a resort of Chinese opium fiends, and the loss of the den and its frequenters was not treated as a national calamity. The shooting at number 11 Fortescue Square was regarded with much more seriousness, and the newspapers were full of it the next day. Thenceforth, however, interest flagged. Mr. Forbes and his family and servants left London for Scotland, and the Amateur Golf Championship came along. So the escapades of a few Chinese fanatics in London were quickly forgotten. They were forgotten, that is, by most people. But one man, Frank Theydon, went back to his flat in Innismore Mansions to plunge into work and strive vainly to obliterate those pages of his memory charged with bitter-sweet daydreams. Strive as he would, and did, to bury the past under the duties and cares of the present, the radiant vision of Evelyn Forbes remained ineffaceable and entrancing. But he was built of tough fibre, and resolutely refused an invitation to visit the Sutherlandshire glen, in which Forbes and his daughter were sedulously nursing to health and strength the dear wife and mother, whose nervous system had suffered far more than she permitted to become known under the stress and strain of the kidnapping experience. Even when Evelyn herself wrote, seconding her father's most friendly note, Theydon pleaded the exigencies of his profession, and filled a letter with an amusing account of Bates's chagrin because he had failed to, quote, bag a Chinaman on his own account, having actually purchased a pistol and fixed it in position before he and his wife quitted the flat. 3 months passed. On August 9, a broiling morning, Theydon was dejectedly reading of preparations for the 12th, when a telegram reached him. It read, "Handyside has arrived here in his car. Come for the gathering of the clan. We take no refusal. Forbes." Theydon travelled north that night. He reached the glen in time for dinner next evening, and passed a few delightfully miserable days in Evelyn's company. At last, feeling that he was losing grip and might act foolishly, he announced to Forbes, one night when a glorious moon was shining, and he knew that Evelyn was awaiting him in the garden, that he must leave for London next day. "Why?" inquired his host. "Has something unforeseen happened? I thought you meant remaining here till the end of the month at the earliest." "I'm sorry," said Theydon, chewing a cigar viciously as a means toward maintaining his self-control. "I'm sorry, but I must go." There was a slight pause. Forbes looked at his young friend with those earnest, deep-seeing eyes of his. "Is it a personal matter?" he went on. "Yes." Again there was a pause. Theydon was well aware that he risked a grave misunderstanding, but that could not be avoided. It might even be better so. And then his blood ran cold, because Forbes was saying, "Are you leaving us because of anything Evelyn has said or done?" "No, no," came the frenzied answer. "Heaven help me! Why do you ask that?" "Heaven helps those who help themselves," said the older man. "That is a trite saying, but it meets the case. I think I diagnose your trouble, my boy. You are in love with Evelyn, and dare not tell her so, because I happen to be a rich man. Really, I didn't think you had so poor an opinion of me as to believe that money or rank would count against my daughter's happiness." He said other things, kindly, wise, appreciative, but Frank Theydon never knew what they were. He managed to stammer out some words of gratitude, and then went to find Evelyn. She had crossed a sloping lawn, and was standing by the side of a little stream that gargled and burbled in joyous career to the nearest loch. She had thrown a white shawl over her head and shoulders, and looked adorably sylph-like as she turned on hearing his footsteps. The moonlight shone on her face, and was reflected in her eyes. "Oh, you're here at last!" she cried gaily. "The next time I ask a cavalier to escort me, he will come more quickly, I imagine." He stood in front of her, and stretched out both hands. "Evelyn," he said, "here is one cavalier, at any rate, who offers himself as an escort for life. The merriment died out of her eyes, and the quip on her tongue failed her. Greatly daring, her lover took her in his arms. Through the open windows of the drawing-room floated the tender refrain of a ballad. Mrs. Forbes was singing, and sweet words blended with sweet music in the still air. Then their lips met, and the dark glen became an earthly paradise. End of chapter 17. End of number 17 by Louis Tracy. Recording by Kirsten Wever.